Mark approve of the way my tie is? Hello and welcome to KAUST Live. We're coming to you from the Winter Enrichment Program. This year's theme is time. Here to speak to us about special moments in time and some of the fascinating stories that surround them is author Dava Sobel. Ms. Sobel, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So I want to start off by thinking about the way that you come at this, the way that you approach storytelling. Did you come at this from the perspective of a scientist enjoying storytelling, or are you a storyteller that found science as a meta topic?
I'm a storyteller who enjoys science.
Very good, very good. And how did you come to that as a center of your work? Was there science in your background? Or?
Yes, I grew up in a household that was very interested in science. Mm-hmm. My mother had trained as a chemist, and my father was a medical doctor. So there was a lot of science talk, and if I asked a question, I got a real answer. And I also got a lot of encouragement, right, because nobody thought it was odd for a girl to be interested in science.
Right.
So it was relatively easy for me. And then I always liked to write, but nobody ever mentioned science writing to me. It wasn't a designated career path when I was growing up, so I fell into it backwards. I wound up getting a job as a newspaper reporter the year of the first Earth Day. And then I started writing about pollution and conservation. And it was science writing, but I still hadn't learned that term.
Right.
But I've been doing more or less the same thing ever since.
And your first book, Longitude, was kind of one of the first in that genre, I think. So talk about helping create that genre in a way. How has it come along in the years since?
That book grew out of a magazine article
I see.
About a conference on the topic of longitude, which seemed almost laughable when I first heard about it, but I was intrigued and attended, and that was the conference that changed my life.
Is this an editor pitching this to you, or
No,
is this you?
No, I met the curator of historical scientific instruments at Harvard. His name was Will Andrews, and he was hosting a conference at Harvard to honor the person who had solved the longitude problem. And I had never known it had been a problem, so this was all very new and interesting to me. And I went to the conference and wrote an article about it for Harvard Magazine. And from that article, I got a book proposal from a small family-owned publishing company in New York. And to my great surprise, the book became a bestseller and then an international bestseller. Right. And here I am in Saudi Arabia as a result.
You know, and that seems like a giant circle for you. One of your latest works involves highlighting female scientists at Harvard. So talk about maybe your relationship with Harvard first.
The Harvard connection has been extremely important to me. I've had several mentors there because I really come to this field as a journalist. Right. And I have needed to learn history of science techniques, learn a lot of science for each of these books, and I've had some wonderful help from professors there.
Right. One of my favorite books is Galileo's Daughter, and of course you would have had to have done extensive research into these letters that were written between the two. Talk about how exciting it must have been to get the letters from Mary Celeste to Galileo, and how disappointing it must have been to find that all of Galileo's letters were gone.
At first I thought that would ruin my story, that I wouldn't be able to tell it as well with only her side of the story. But then I realized it actually made the story more poignant. There was a greater sense of loss, of being able to see from her letters, because she often repeated things he had said to her, just how loving their relationship had been. And unfortunately, no letters from Galileo to any of his 3 children have survived. And people have combed the Vatican Library, private collections. They may still be out there, but not as far as I know.
So this starts into one of the threads of your work that seems to come up. As a reader, you get the sense that you're often talking about female scientists and females as patrons of science. Talk about how that's evolved as a topic for you.
That's a recent evolution because the Longitude story really doesn't have any women. And Galileo's daughter, although she was brilliant and a great support to him, she wasn't really a scientist. She was the convent apothecary, so I guess you could call her a scientist, but she was in no way an astronomer. But my latest book is all about a group of women who were employed at the Harvard Observatory, partly because they were women, which meant that they would work for less money than a man. And there was a lot of important work that needed to be done. So the director was keen to have a large staff, and the way to do that was to bring in women.
We haven't progressed as much as we'd like along that continuum with equal pay necessarily.
And this is definitely still true.
I'm wondering about your creative process. So since we're talking about time, how do you structure your time and how do you make sure you get the most out of your creative time?
I have learned from long experience of living that my best time is first thing in the morning. I can do in 20 minutes, first thing in the morning, what it would take me 2 hours to do in the evening. So my ideal day is to get out of bed and go right to work. And sometimes that's reading, sometimes it's writing, because there's a lot of reading involved in what I do.
Of course,
So to spend at least that first hour just not thinking about anything outside the world of that project. And then I might have breakfast and probably spend a good part of the morning writing, but I must write a certain number of words or a certain number of pages. I don't impose any artificial quota like that on myself. If it's going well, I keep going. If it's not going well, I try to stop the pain as soon as possible. There are a lot of bad days when it just doesn't go well.
So it's about being in it or not in a way. And you ask your readers to do the same. You ask them to do quite a bit of time traveling. So from a writer/historian perspective, how do you choose, and I'm sure this is a constant fight for you, but how do you choose what gets into the final manuscript and what gets set aside?
Well, that is the big question, because if you tried to tell every detail, you wouldn't have a story, or you would lose the story. So at each step, each interesting fact that I might want to report has to somehow move the story forward. And if it doesn't, then it goes into notes at the end, or it just falls away.
Is there an other book file that's full of these sort of anecdotes?
Well, I hadn't thought of that, but no.
Because that to me is possibly what seemed to happen. You wrote Galileo's Daughter, and then later you wrote a book and a play about Copernicus. Which of those came first, and how did you tease out the story of these two fairly inextricably linked historical characters?
I had the Copernicus idea first. As soon as I learned that he had really hesitated for decades to make his ideas known, and that he'd been talked into it by a young genius who came to him from a foreign nation, a religion that had been abolished where Copernicus lived.
Right.
There was everything working against them, but somehow this young fellow stayed and talked him into doing what he'd avoided doing for a lifetime.
Right.
And that was fascinating to me.
So Copernicus paid the ultimate price for what he ultimately was saying, right? I mean, he was...
Well, he died as his book was in publication, so he
Right.
never knew what the reception was.
Right.
He had waited so long that his life was at a natural end. And I wanted to write a play, but I was young then and was easily daunted by the difficulty of writing a play.
Right.
And so it wasn't until after Longitude that I wrote Galileo's Daughter, and the idea came directly from Longitude,
Right.
because I had never known about his children. I discovered that in doing some research on Galileo's work on Longitude, and found this one letter to him from his eldest child, who was a nun. That was a big surprise because I'd been taught Galileo was an enemy of the church.
Right.
Here he had not one but two daughters who were nuns, and I thought, there's a story there.
Right.
And I had studied Italian at university, so I thought I could read these letters and see how they related to his work, because it seemed to me that he had done everything he had done
Right.
as a believing Catholic, which was very different from what most people think about him.
Yeah.
And I'm not Catholic myself, but again, the idea was fascinating to me. And Copernicus was an officer of the Catholic Church. So there were many parallels in their lives.
Right.
So I wrote Galileo's Daughter, and then some years later, in learning about a very interesting quest by a Harvard professor named Owen Gingerich to try to recover all the first editions of Copernicus's book, and this is from 1543, that survived to the present day. And he had traveled all over the world to find them, examine them, figure out who had read them, who had owned them. And reading his book revived my idea for a play. And so I decided I was old enough now to take on a new challenge. And that's what I did. So I wrote the story of the play about how he was talked into publishing his crazy idea. And then my publisher suggested writing a book around the play to explain the conditions that led up to their meeting. Everyone knows the meeting took place. It was this young man who oversaw the publication of the book. But of course, no one knows what they said to each other.
Right.
And that's what the play was about. And then afterward, what happened to the book? How did it influence Kepler, Galileo, other thinkers?
Yeah.
And what is its value today?
Right. So then the idea for writing a play came in wanting to know this story that almost couldn't be known? So you knew that historical fact years before. Fascinating. Longitude was published in 1995.
Yes.
And from that point, as you say, you became a full-time author of books.
Yes.
What pressures, what changes came with that sudden notoriety?
Well, there was pressure to do something else, which I very much wanted to do. And then there's a greater need to apportion your time because you're working on a much longer time scale. So there may be years worth of research for a particular book. Galileo's Daughter took about 5 years.
Wow.
And all that time, you are directing, you are daily, weekly, monthly schedule. You have some sense of the amount of work involved, although it grows once you get started.
Right.
You have to figure out what you need to know to be able to tell this story and how to find it out.
Right.
Sometimes there's travel involved. I went to Italy several times. I saw the original letters. I had read them in a published form because they'd all been published with Galileo's complete works.
In Italian?
Yes, yeah, but again, I had the college level training, and it's a wonderful thing to find that the things you learn when you're young actually stay with you. If you just wake them up, they're still there. So I took some adult ed refresher courses in conversational Italian, and then I went back to her letters. First thing I did was just copy them all out to see what it would feel like to write those sentences, be the person expressing those thoughts in that language. And that really gave me a feeling for the cadence of her language. And that made Galileo's Daughter a very different sounding book from Longitude. Because I wanted to stay true to her expression.
Is the convent still in existence, and did you go visit that space to get a sense for her life? You talk a lot in the book about the sort of meager existence that they were living. Talk a little bit about that.
The physical building is still there, but it's no longer a convent. But I was happy to discover it was occupied by a small group of Carmelite fathers, and they were her favorite priests. And I just knocked on the door, said I was a writer from America and could I come in? And they invited me in and showed me around. And some of the rooms seemed unchanged. There was an olive grove at the back. Probably those trees were centuries old. And then from the back of the convent, you could see the house where Galileo lived. So it was a very important visit.
And so she would have been that close. She would have been not just thinking about, but actually envisioning him at home.
Although she couldn't leave the convent, he could visit her.
I see.
It was a short walk.
As a meta topic, I wonder, over time, do you feel that we've lost some of our sense of wonder about science, our awe about nature? I feel like one of the ingredients in much of your writing is helping us understand how people stood in awe of natural events and then spent years, decades even, exploring them. Where do you think we're at now, since you write about science in this? Do you feel that we've lost this? How do you feel about that?
Well, in the United States, there is a terrible and dangerous disregard for science at the highest levels of the government. So I worry about that a lot. And I think everywhere in the world, we are distracted from attention to natural things. The number of children who will never see the Milky Way depresses me. There are now dark sky preserves because there's recognition of the fact that we need to preserve a live view of the universe. Just for our well-being. The scientists have spacecraft, major observatories in space. They are not as dependent on those things, I don't think, as the average person is. And most people don't even know what they're missing.
Growing up as a child, there probably would have been some light pollution where you grew up. Did you travel out to see stars?
I grew up in New York City, so there was already considerable light pollution. But my parents were sailors. So when we were out on the water, you could really see the night sky. And my mother trained as a navigator, so she knew all the constellations, and all of that was given to me.
Wow. Do you think some of the seeds of your book your books were planted in those moments?
Sure.
I wonder, do you ever go back and reread, not necessarily as an editor, but again as a storyteller, do you go back and reread your pieces and appreciate some of the things that were a bit prophetic, some of the things that the topics have changed in our conversation over time?
Sometimes I reread them just because I can't remember what was in them.
Okay.
And there's a lot of information in each one that I wish I could hold in my head, but I find that I cannot. So I reread Longitude just before coming here, and I enjoyed it. That's really what you want to see. Yeah. Does it hold up? Would you still be proud of it? Would you make it better? Do you think you've lost the ability to tell a story in as engaging a way? So it's a check on oneself to do that.
Are there any more works that are going to be performed on the stage in your mind? Do you have some other great story that you're really sort of thinking of?
To write as a play?
Yes. Yeah.
No, I don't think I would try to do that again, but somebody else is interested in making a film of the glass universe. Okay. And I would love to see that happen. Yeah. This is the story of the women at Harvard. Right. And some of those characters are rich, interesting people, and absolutely. I think it would make a great film.
So you're speaking at 5:30,
yes.
Giving a keynote. Give us a teaser for what you're going to be talking about.
I'm going to talk about longitude as a matter of time, because the whole problem of solving the difficulties of navigation depended completely on being able to build precision timekeepers and to make them fit for travel so that people could carry the time with them and know where they were.
Right. Well, it's fascinating, and we really appreciate you coming to speak with us, and best of luck with this evening's keynote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah. And that's all the time that we have for today. Join us tonight at 5:30 for Ms. Sobel's keynote. Remember to comment, like, and share using the hashtag WEP 2019. And from everyone here at KAUST, thank you for joining us.